scrutinize and to weigh the testimony of witnesses and to determine the effect of the evidence as a whole. You are the sole judges of the credibility, that is, the believability of the witnesses and of the weight to be given to their testimony. In determining the credibility of each witness and the weight you give to the testimony of each witness, consider these factors. Whether the witness has an interest or lack of interest in the result of this trial, the witness's conduct, appearance, and demeanor on the witness stand, the clearness or lack of clearness of the witness's recollections, the opportunity the witness had for observing and for knowing the matters the witness testified about, the reasonableness of the witness's testimony, the apparent intelligence of the witness, bias or prejudice, if any has been shown, possible motives for falsifying testimony, and all other facts and circumstances during the trial which tend either to support or to discredit the testimony. Then give to the testimony of each witness the weight you believe it should receive. There is no magic way for you to evaluate the testimony. Instead, you should use your common sense and experience. In everyday life, you determine for yourselves the reliability of things people say to you. You should do the same thing here. Evidence has been received that some of the witnesses in this trial have been convicted of crimes. The evidence was received solely because it bears upon the credibility of the witness. It must not be used for any other purpose. A defendant in a criminal case has the absolute constitutional right not to testify. The defendant's decision not to testify must not be considered by you in any way and must not influence your verdict in any manner. The state has introduced evidence of statements which it claims were made by the defendant. It is for you to determine how much weight, if any, to give each statement. In evaluating each statement, you must determine three things: whether the statement was actually made by the defendant, only so much of a statement as was actually made by a person may be considered as evidence, whether the statement was accurately restated here at trial, and whether the statement or any part of it ought to be believed. You should consider the facts and circumstances surrounding the making of each statement, along with all the other evidence in determining how much weight, if any, the statement deserves. Evidence has been presented regarding other conduct of the defendant for which the defendant is not on trial. Specifically, evidence has been presented that the defendant was involved in an incident with Matt Robinson, November 18, 2006, during which Mr. Robinson was stabbed in the neck by the defendant, and that the defendant wrote a letter on January 4, 2012 to Savannah Cease, in which he described an incident in 2000 where he was concerned his girlfriend was with another man, so he grabbed some knives to make her tell him who she was involved with. If you find this conduct did occur, you should consider it only on the issue of identity as to all counts charged, and on the issue of plan as the attempted armed robbery count. You may not consider this evidence to conclude that the defendant has a certain character or a certain character trait, and that the defendant acted in conformity with that trait or character with respect to the offenses charged in this case. The evidence was received on the issue of identity, that is, whether the prior conduct of the defendant is so similar to the offenses charged that it tends to identify the defendant as the one who committed the offenses charged. The evidence was received on the issue of plan, that is, whether the other conduct of the defendant was part of a design or scheme that led to the commission of an attempted armed robbery offense charged today. You may consider this evidence only for the purposes I have described, giving it the weight you determine it deserves. It is not to be used to conclude the defendant is a bad person, and for that reason is guilty of the offenses charged. Evidence has been received that defendant Kristopher Torgerson was in custody, in jail, and prison facilities at various times prior to the trial of this matter. This evidence was received to provide context, essentially location, as it relates to testimony of certain witnesses in the state's case in chief. It may not be considered for any other purpose. You may not consider this evidence of prior custody in jail and prison facilities to conclude that the defendant is guilty of any of the offenses charged here. In reaching your verdict, examine the evidence with care and caution. Act with judgment, reason, and prudence. Defendants are not required to prove their innocence. The law presumes every person charged with the commission of an offense to be innocent. This presumption requires a finding of not guilty, unless in your deliberations you find it is overcome by evidence which satisfies you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. The burden of establishing every fact necessary to constitute guilt is upon the state. Before you can return a verdict of guilty, the evidence must satisfy you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. If you can reconcile the evidence upon any reasonable hypothesis consistent with the defendant's innocence, you should do so and return a verdict of not guilty. The term reasonable doubt means a doubt based upon reason and common sense. It is a doubt for which a reason can be given, arising from a fair and rational consideration of the evidence or lack of evidence. It means such a doubt as would cause a person of ordinary prudence to pause or hesitate when called upon to act in the most important affairs of life. A reasonable doubt is not a doubt which is based on mere guesswork or speculation. A doubt which arises merely from sympathy or from fear to return a verdict of guilt is not a reasonable doubt. A reasonable doubt is not a doubt such as may be used to escape the responsibility of a decision. While it is your duty to give the defendant the benefit of every reasonable doubt, you are not to search for doubt. You are to search for the truth. First-degree intentional homicide, as defined in the criminal code, is committed by one who causes the death of another human being with the intent to kill that person or another. Before you may find the defendant guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, the state must prove by evidence which satisfies you beyond a reasonable doubt that the following two elements were present. First, the defendant caused the death of Stephanie Lowe. Cause means that the defendant's act was a substantial factor in producing the death. Second, the defendant acted with the intent to kill Stephanie Lowe. Intent to kill means that the defendant had a mental purpose to take the life of another human being or was aware that his conduct was practically certain to cause the death of another human being. While the law requires that the defendant acted with intent to kill, it does not require that the intent exists for any particular length of time before the act is committed. The act need not be brooded over, considered, or reflected upon for a week, a day, an hour, or even a minute. There need not be any appreciable time between the formation of the intent and the act. The intent to kill may be formed at any time before the act, including the instant before the act. It must continue to exist at the time of the act. You cannot look into a person's mind to find intent. Intent to kill must be found, if found at all, from the defendant's acts, words, and statements, if any, and from all the facts and circumstances in this case bearing upon intent. Intent should not be confused with motive. While proof of intent is necessary to a conviction, proof of motive is not. Motive refers to a person's reason for doing something. While motive may be shown as a circumstance to aid in establishing the guilt of the defendant, the state is not required to prove motive on the part of a defendant in order to convict. Evidence of motive does not by itself establish guilt. You should give it the weight you believe it deserves under all the circumstances. If you are satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant caused the death of Stephanie Lowe with intent to kill, you should find the defendant guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. If you are not so satisfied, you must find the defendant not guilty. The defendant is charged with armed robbery. Attempted armed robbery. The crime of attempted armed robbery, as defined in the criminal code, is committed by one who, with intent to commit armed robbery, does an act for the commission of that crime which demonstrates unequivocally, under all of the circumstances, that he or she had formed that intent and would commit the crime except for the intervention of another person or some other extraneous factor. Before you may find the defendant guilty of this offense, the state must prove by evidence which satisfies you beyond a reasonable doubt that the following two elements were present. The first element of attempted armed robbery requires that the defendant intended to commit the crime of armed robbery. The crime of armed robbery is committed by one who first takes and carries away property from the person or from the presence of the owner of the property, and second, takes the property with the intent to steal, and third, acts forcibly, and fourth, uses or threatens to use a dangerous weapon. Intent to steal requires the mental purpose to take and carry away movable property of another without consent, and the intent to deprive the owner permanently of possession of the property. The crime charged against the defendant in this case, however, is not armed robbery as defined, but an attempt to commit the crime of armed robbery. The second element of attempted armed robbery requires that the defendant did an act toward the commission of the crime of armed robbery, which demonstrates unequivocally, under all the circumstances, that the defendant intended to and would have committed the crime of armed robbery except for the intervention of another person or some other extraneous factor. Unequivocally means that no other inference or conclusion can reasonably and fairly be drawn from the defendant's acts under the circumstances. Another person means anyone but the defendant and may include the intended victim. An extraneous factor is something outside the knowledge of the defendant or outside the defendant's control. You cannot look into a person's mind to find intent. Intent must be found, if found at all, from the defendant's acts, words, and statements, if any, and from all of the facts and circumstances in this case bearing upon intent. If you are satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that all of the elements of attempted armed robbery have been proved, you should find the defendant guilty. If you are not so satisfied, you must find the defendant not guilty. The Criminal Code of Wisconsin is violated by one who hides or buries a corpse with intent to conceal a crime, avoid apprehension, prosecution, or conviction for a crime. Before you may find the defendant guilty of this offense, the state must prove by evidence which satisfies you beyond a reasonable doubt that the following two elements were present. One, the defendant hid a corpse, and two, the defendant hid a corpse with intent to conceal a crime, avoid apprehension, prosecution, or conviction for a crime. This requires the defendant acted with the purpose to conceal a crime, avoid apprehension, prosecution, or conviction for a crime. You cannot look into a person's mind to find out intent. Intent must be found, if found at all, from the defendant's acts, words, and statements, if any, and from all the facts and circumstances in this case bearing upon intent. If you are satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that both elements of this offense have been proved, you should find the defendant guilty. If you are not so satisfied, you must find the defendant not guilty. Consider carefully the closing arguments of the attorney, but their arguments and conclusions and opinions are not evidence. Draw your own conclusions from the evidence and decide upon your verdict according to the evidence under the instructions given you by this court. We'll begin with the state's closing arguments. I just want to tell the jury that a copy of these instructions will be sent to the jury. Go ahead.
Please, clerk, counsel. Switch to. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury,
I told multiple people. She probably did, just to tell them off. That way they would get bugging her. You know, that's part of the game. You put shit on other people so they'll quit bugging you. And why not put it off on me? Because my name's Spider. People don't fuck with me. That's my rep out there, you know. People hate me, but they don't fuck with me. I get what I want, and I do what I please.
I get what I want, I do as I please. The morning of October 10th, 2010, the defendant wanted crack cocaine. He heard he didn't have any money. He was complaining to Rich about his lack of money. He didn't have any money. He heard it from the defense own witness, Gretchen Huff. He was always mooching on it. He was desperate for crack cocaine. He would do anything for crack cocaine. And unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, for Stephanie Lowe, anything, included robbery and murder. He took the life of this 22-year-old young lady who Mom told you was trying to turn her life around, trying to go back to school, wanting to become a social worker. He took her life to satisfy his need for crack cocaine. Let's take a look at what the defendant is charged with. He's charged with the first-degree intentional homicide, the murder of Stephanie Lowe. He's charged with attempted armed robbery of Stephanie Lowe, trying to rob her the drugs and the money she had. And finally, he's charged with drugs of Stephanie Lowe. I think it's always important to start out in the closing argument with what's not at issue. What's really not at issue in this case? What the evidence has clearly shown there's not really any dispute about it. Well, there's no dispute about the fact that the defendant is guilty of hiding the corpse of Stephanie Lowe. There's no dispute about that because you heard it right in the defendant's own opening statement. The evidence in this case will prove, the defense admitted, the evidence will prove beyond a reasonable doubt. The counsel even said beyond any doubt the defendant is guilty of that offense. And the evidence did, in fact, prove beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant is guilty of that. The defendant is the one who took law enforcement, brought them to the site where Stephanie Lowe was buried. All of the evidence shows that the defendant hid Stephanie Lowe's body right from the start, covering her in sheets, blankets, and pillows as he carried her with Richard Hawkins out of her apartment on 701.5 West Thomas Street. As he placed her body covered back of his 1995 Jeep Grand Cherokee. There's no question the defendant is guilty of that offense. And there's no question that Stephanie Lowe was murdered. The blood in the apartment tells us that. The opinion of Dr. Steer tells us that. We can't give you an exact cause of death, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But clearly, Stephanie Lowe was murdered. And there is no question, ladies and gentlemen, that the person responsible for Stephanie Lowe's death is in this courtroom. It's that defendant there. To the counsel table. The defendant is the one who killed Stephanie Lowe. And all of the evidence in this case points directly to the defendant, and only to the defendant, as the person who took her life. We're going to talk about that evidence in a little bit. We're going to talk about that throughout. We know the defendant is the one who took Stephanie Lowe's life because he told multiple people. He told 6 different people that you heard from that he is the one who took Stephanie Lowe's life. And that he did it intentionally because she wouldn't give him what he wanted. And remember, he gets what he wants and he does as he pleases. And if you even believe one of those individuals, if you even believe one of the people that you heard get up here on this witness stand, get up and sit right here and tell you what the defendant told you. If you believe even one. the defendant is guilty of every single count that he was charged with. You don't even have to rely upon even one of them, though, because you heard it in his own words, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But let's first talk about who he told. He started with Richard Hawkins. He started when he brought Mr. Hawkins. So no 1.5 West Thomas Street. The early morning hours of October. That's the first person he admitted that he killed. The next person is his then girlfriend, Andrea Wadinsky. He told her, yes, I killed him. He then, the next summer, tells his ex-wife, Rebecca Torgerson, as he's driving her to Labino, trying to get rid of evidence he was concerned with his dad. He told Adam Smith. We're going to talk about what he told each one of these people and why they're believable, why you should believe what they have to say. He told Adam Smith, while they were voting, they were at a party, and then talked to him again while we were in the jail. He told Doug Koplitz that he did. Doug Koplitz that he had killed Stephanie Lowe. He told Jacob Stoltz. All 6 of these people, every single one, admitted, I am the one that killed Stephanie Lowe. No one else was innocent. But you don't even have to rely on that because you heard his own words, you heard his own voice in 2 separate recordings admitting that he killed Stephanie Lowe. You heard a portion of the recording of the drive between Wausau and Labino the night of September 18th, 2014. When Detective Holtz tells the defendant, you know, when he's ready, I'd like to sit down with you and find out what happened. I'd like to fill in all the pieces. And the defendant says, yeah, I'm the one that can fill in those pieces. I'm the one that can tell you what happened. He says, it's this intentional thing. I didn't intentionally take her life. Doesn't say, I didn't take her life, someone else did. He says, I didn't intentionally take her life. We're going to talk about his definition of intent, and the definition of intent that the judge just gave you a little while ago when he told you what intention means in a sense. It's not what the defendant thought it is. And what he did was an intentional taking of the life. Stephanie Lowe. I was not denying that conversation already. He is the one who killed Stephanie Lowe. In fact, admit that he was the one. A few months later, January of 2015, he's talking to Andrea's mother, Yvonne Wadinsky. And Yvonne is telling him that Andrea really doesn't want to have to get up here, doesn't want to have to get on that witness stand and testify against him. You saw it was difficult for her to testify. You saw it. She admitted, she says, I'd rather be just about anywhere than right here. She got up there. She testified. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But Yvonne is telling him she doesn't want to do that. And what he says, again, I did not intentionally take her life. I took her life, it just wasn't intentional. So what do you need to decide? What are you going to have to decide in this case? You're going to have to decide, did the defendant attempt to rob Stephanie Lowe of her drugs and money? And did the defendant intentionally take the life of Stephanie Lowe? Credibility of the witnesses is one of the most important things that you're going to have to decide. The judge has told you what you need to consider. There are a few things that I want to highlight that. One of the things you need to consider is the clearness, the lack of clearness of the witness's testimony. You've heard that. You've heard all of that. We're going to talk about that as it relates to how they. You need to consider their ability to see what they said they saw or hear what they said they heard. You need to consider what motive, if any, has been shown for them lying to you on the witness stand. You have to consider the interest, or in this case, ladies and gentlemen, with virtually all of the witnesses that the state has called, the lack of interest of that witness in the outcome of the trial. You need to consider their conduct and demeanor. How did they act on the stand? Did they admit when there were things that they needed to admit? Did they agree on the things they needed to agree to? Did they try to dance around the truth? Did they just come right out and tell it? The apparent intelligence of the witnesses. I think that's especially important when you consider Richard Hawkins. We'll talk about that when we talk about him a little bit. And finally, the judge said any other facts and circumstances that you think are important, and one of the things that I've always found is important is the consistency of their testimony, the consistency with what they've said before. So I'm going to put this up so that you've got all that information. And think about this as you think about the various people we're going to talk about. That's what we just looked at under credibility, and that's a summary of what the judges told you. So what about Richard Hawkins? Well, there's no doubt about the fact that Richard Hawkins initially did not tell the truth. Why? I'm not going to get up here and tell you that he was truthful right from the start. But think about the situation. Think about the situation that Richard Hawkins was in. The morning of October 10th. He's been out the night before with the defendant. He's in a city he'd never been to before. Been there only a couple months. Doesn't know many people. Had a young lady that he spent some time with for a little while, a month or so ago. He was no longer involved with her. How many he really knew? How many people he really knew? The defendant's girlfriend. He was dependent on them for food, for a place to stay, basically for everything, because he didn't have any money of his own. So what happens? Mr. Hawkins is awakened from sleep for only a few hours, brought to 701.5 West Thomas Street. After stopping a quick trip on Grand Avenue. Brought up to an apartment, showed the body, Stephanie Lowe. He'd just been murdered by the defendant. Killed in cold blood by the defendant. When he asks him, "What did you do?" he's told, "She didn't give me what I wanted." The implication from that is, she didn't give me what I wanted, so I killed her. The defendant then says, "You got to help me get rid of her." What is he to do? He knows that Stephanie Lowe was just murdered because she didn't give the defendant what he wanted. If he doesn't help, if he doesn't give the defendant what he wants, at that moment, is he the next person that's going to get killed? And then he's told by the defendant, "You know what? You're now just as responsible for this as me." He's scared of the defendant, and he's scared of the police because he's been told he's responsible now. And he knows that he eventually does help the defendant move the body. So he lies about it. He doesn't want to get in trouble. Not an unreasonable reaction. But there's no question, when he testified on that witness stand, he got up there and testified about what he did that day. That he told you the truth about what he did that day. We know that because everything he told you he did that day, and he testified about, physical evidence in this case supports what I'm witness. What does he say happened? And that he did. I'm just talking about his actions, and now what the defendant told me. He says he got up and they left, and they went to a store on the way to Stephanie Lowe's apartment. Yes, we know. The defendant stopped at the Quick Trip on Grand Avenue at 6:45 in the morning. And we know if you, just by looking at the picture of the defendant's vehicle, it's still dark, which is what he said when that happened. We know that. We know from there they got the body of Stephanie Lowe and went to the store out in Weston. And you know what? We know that happened because we have the records that show that they were there. He says they then drove up to Wabeno, went to the cabin, got rid of the boat. We know that happened. We have the pictures of the boat there, a boat that wasn't there the day before, and then Rocky Ison told you showed up that morning. We know it was that morning because he posted the Facebook pictures the next day showing the boat there. We know they then went to Pinch's hardware store. He didn't know the name of the store, but he knew it was a hardware store a little ways away because we have the purchase of the shovel that occurs that day, that morning, just like he said. We know they then went back to the cabin and drove past it because there were people there. We know that again because the Ison told you that, yes, I was there that day, working on the roof. And I saw a vehicle go by. It drew my attention, but I couldn't really get a good look at it because I was on the roof, and if I had turned too fast, I would have fallen through it, all the way down to the creek. And we know they then went from there down a forest road and buried the body. So, well, that's because that's where Stephanie Lowe's body is found. You know, ladies and gentlemen, the rock was placed over Stephanie Lowe because you saw that rock. You saw law enforcement having to move that rock off of the area. Stephanie Lowe's body was. The rock was placed there. Every single one of those facts is true. Absolutely true. Now, Richard Hawkins is obviously not very good with times. And I mean, that's clear. I mean, he thought they left breakaway at 10, 11 o'clock, and we know they left at midnight because it was on the surveillance video. And they went to Quick Trip, and we know when that was based on surveillance video. So we know he's not very good with time. And we know they're coming back to Stephanie Lowe's apartment at about 5:45 because that's when they're at the Quick Trip on Grand Avenue. So we know he's not good with time. And that's part of the fact that you've got to see Mr. Hawkins on the stand. You've got to see, he's not, clearly, I don't think he's developmentally delayed, but clearly he's not the most intelligent individual out there. He has his limitations, and he does the best he can. And he was truthful to you on the witness stand about all of those things. And if he's telling you the truth about that, why does he lie about what the defendant told him when they got to the apartment? Why does he make up that story? He doesn't have to say anything about what the defendant told him when they get back there. Now I know counsel is probably going to say, well, he made that up so that he wouldn't get charged with his role in hiding the corpse. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, think about Mr. Hoffman's position. Think about what the position he was placed in by the defendant in this case. And ask yourself, would it be justice to even think about charging Mr. Hoffman? Would that be just under the circumstances? Or did he have no real choice to save his own life that morning, but to help the defendant? That brings us to Andrea Wadinsky, and again, no question, she was not truthful to law enforcement in numerous interviews between 2011, 2012, and into the first part of the interview on February 12th of 2013. And she admitted that she wasn't truthful. Now, counsel made a big deal out of asking her about, well, did you say this in this particular interview, on this particular date? And many times she says, yes, I said that, and it was truthful. Sometimes she didn't remember she said that on that particular date. She's interviewed how many times? Counsel asked her 10, 12, 15 times she was interviewed by law enforcement. The fact that she couldn't remember, did I say that in this interview versus this interview versus this interview versus this interview? Is that surprising? Is that any surprise? Even Detective Boltz, who studied her interviews to prepare for testimony, at times couldn't remember, was that in that interview or a different interview that she said this? And she had not seen a report. And she only saw one since February of 2013. Not a surprise that she can't remember a particular one, but when asked, she admitted, yes, I lied to law enforcement. And she told you why. She was worried about going to jail. Not a good surprise. She told you she was worried about losing her children. She goes to jail, that's going to be a problem. That's not a great surprise. But she also told you that the biggest thing she was worried about, the biggest concern she had, she was worried about her safety. She was worried the defendant would do to her. Yeah. This stuff really well. And it was not that unreasonable a worry, because you heard the federal government helped her move to protect her safety because of what she told me. But again, there was no question what she said about hiding the body of Stephanie was truthful. Because the evidence, the physical evidence, the records of events that happened on October 10th confirm what she said happened. What did she say happened? She says she gets called at about 7:20 in the morning, somewhere around there, from the defendant asking for directions to the cabin in Lambino. All right? All records show the defendant calling her at approximately that time. And you know what those records show? You got to see this exhibit. I'm going to put this up for a second over the top of this. What does it show? These are the calls that the defendant's making at that time. And where does it show him? It shows him on this tower right here. The tower that is right here, right near the store in Westland. The location she then tells you she went to, and the defendant pumped gas, and she pumped gas. And you know what? The records from the bank and from the store confirm, yeah, paid for gas that was pumped at 2 separate pumps. And she bought 2 candy bars, defendant's 2 children being with her at the same time. Hopefully help keep them quiet on a long drive. She tells you that, yes, I directed him to a hardware store. I don't know the name of it, but I knew it was down in Townsend, and I directed him that way, and sure enough, the defendant goes to that hardware store. And she's truthful about things that the defendant told her happened, because she told you that the defendant told her later that, yeah, we went to the hardware store, we bought the shovel, and came back, and there was somebody there. And we came back, so we had to keep driving. You know that's truthful. You know that's the truth, because again, you heard it from Lucky Dyson. So she's even been proved truthful in what she tells us the defendant told her. And the defendant told her that there was a knife that was with Stephanie Lowe's body. He told her it came from her knives. We'll talk about the knives a little more in a little while. But there was a knife with Stephanie Lowe's body. Proved that she's telling you the truth about what the defendant told her, as well as what she saw with her own 2 eyes. So why, ladies and gentlemen, would she not be truthful? Would she be truthful on all of that? But why, when she tells you that the defendant admitted something bad to Stephanie, his girl, and he needed to fix it? Why? What about Rebecca Torgerson? Well, we know that Rebecca Torgerson told you the truth about what the defendant told her the night of August 24th, 2011. We know the defendant was with her that night because they got stuck in a ditch and had contact with the Langley County Sheriff's Department a year ago. So we know they were together. And we know what she told you the defendant told her what happened. And what he told her about the night of October 10th, 2011. She said, he told me he buried Stephanie Lowe's body near Andrew's cabin. You know what, ladies and gentlemen? That's true. We know it's true because we know when Detective Holtz and Lieutenant Cole and Detective Buckner went with the defendant, first on September 18th, then on September 19th, 2014, that they found Stephanie Lowe buried in a shallow grave in Yvonne Wadinsky's cabin. He told Rebecca Torgerson she's buried under a rock. You know what? She was. You saw that. And she told you that the defendant scratched, or, I'm sorry, that Stephanie scratched the defendant. Something that Andrew Wadinsky also told you happened. Why did they get this same minor detail? Say, is it true? And finally, she tells you there's a broken knife in Stephanie's body. A knife that will help connect the defendant to this crime. You know what? Ask yourself, what is her motive for lying? Why would she lie? children back, to keep her defendant from her children. Well, I don't think you want a murderer with your children. You got to observe her conduct and her demeanor. Everything about her situation that was not very positive, she was willing to admit without any question. She admitted all the things that she's done in the past, all the things, all the mistakes she's made in the past. Without hesitation, without any question. And ladies and gentlemen, the testimony is consistent, all in all. The testimony is consistent with the known facts. Facts she could only know from one source. That source is the defendant. What about Adam Smith? Well, Adam Smith has no motive at all. I know counsel is, when you ask for release from your probation hold, but he was told by the officers, you heard that, they couldn't help him with that. And he still told them he will. Told them. Instead of hurried up north. The defendant needed to get her hands. Consistent theme with everybody that we've heard from just about. He needed to cut off her hands because his hands were tied to his guns. He needed to go and bury the body, bury He testified consistently with what he had to say before. And you know what? What happened after he talked to law enforcement? Law enforcement reasonably went to talk to Andrea and find out if they could get any more from her. And that gets back to the defendant. What does he do? He attacks Adam Smith. Adam Smith received absolutely no consideration for his testimony. What about Doug Coplitz? What did we hear from him? Well, again, Doug Coplitz testifies to information that only the defendant could tell him. That Stephanie Lowe was buried up north. That the knife broke and was with the body of Stephanie Lowe. Truthful things. We know they're truthful because the facts support them. And Stephanie Lowe scratched it. Ask yourself, what's the motive for lying? Why would Doug Coplitz lie about the defendant? What interest does he have in the outcome of this case? Oh, he's a friend of Rebecca Torgerson. You're going to get up on the stand? Is he going to get up here and lie to you about that because he's a friend of Rebecca Torgerson at some point in time? Why? It makes no sense. Jacob Stoltz had no connection prior to talking to law enforcement with any of the other witnesses. He didn't become a friend of Rebecca Torgerson until 2 years later. So clearly he's not, couldn't get the information from Rebecca Torgerson, couldn't get it from anybody else. And yet he tells you facts consistent with everybody else. Stephanie Lowe is buried. You need to get that body out of there. Gives you another piece of information. Piece of information that tells you a lot about the defendant and whether or not he was intentionally taking Stephanie Lowe's life, because he tells you the defendant told him. It's a real rush to hold somebody's life. Told you that it's consistent with everybody else. You held her life in his hands as he strangled her. Choked her, killed her. She died. Consistent with everybody else, he told you that when they find her body, the oven's time to kill her. And ask yourself, if he's making this up for whatever reason, again, he has no motive to lie, he has no bias, he has no interest in this case. If he's making it up, why doesn't he just say, he told me it was Stephanie Lowe? Why does he say, you know, I could tell by the context of this was all about Stephanie Lowe, but he never used her name. If you're making something up, you're going to make it up a little bit more, a little bit stronger, and specifically positive, Stephanie Lowe. Throughout all of these statements of every one of these witnesses, there are consistent themes. Consistent themes that we know are true. Stephanie Lowe is buried. Absolutely, positively true. No doubt about that. He was worried that there would be DNA under the fingernails of Stephanie Lowe. Now, he's fortunate. We'll talk about that in a second. There wasn't, but we know that Andrea observed a scratch on his face, and we know that Dr. Steer told you 2 of her fingernails showed signs of trauma. Trauma, ladies and gentlemen, in your experience, you can certainly understand from scratches. From fighting for your life, scratching someone. Where's the DNA going to be? It's going to be underneath the fingernails. Something the defendant was worried about. It's something that Benjamin Starkey told you, unfortunately, the defendant managed to destroy by burying her body for almost 4. I mean, you heard that even her own, Stephanie Lowe's own tissue, we know came from her body, had degraded such that he couldn't get a full profile of that tissue. But we know that those fingernails had presumptive positive test for blood. Now, that's not by itself enough. It's not conclusive proof that it's blood. It could be other things. But they were presumptively positive for blood. You just couldn't recover any DNA because those hands, those fingernails, were buried by the defendant for almost 4 years. Don't reward him for destroying the evidence by his actions. Actions that he has admitted through his counsel happened in his own statement. We know that Stephanie Lowe, as everybody said, is buried up north. And absolutely true. They all said consistently she's buried under a rock. Absolutely true. And consistently told people there's a knife with her body that would tie him to the murder. Absolutely true. You saw that knife yourself. It was recovered with Stephanie Lowe's. What about physical evidence? There is some physical evidence in this case. And there's not, in some ways, there's not physical evidence in other ways, and we'll talk about this. But the physical evidence tells us with certainty that Stephanie Lowe was murdered in her home. Because we find her blood. We find her blood on the bed. We find her blood on the wall. We find her blood on the table. We find her blood on the floor. We find her blood on a lottery ticket. We find her blood on various items of clothing. All that blood tells us Stephanie Lowe was murdered. 701.5 West Pine Street. Her home. Well, she should have been saved. But she wasn't. We know that Stephanie Lowe, from the physical evidence, was killed sometime after 1 a.m. in the morning, shortly after 1 a.m. in the morning. October 10th. We know that from the phone records. Phone records in this case are physical evidence. They're not blood, they're not DNA, but they're physical evidence. They're things that can't be changed. And those phone records show she's constantly on her phone until 12:58 a.m. She makes one last call. There's one last voicemail of her far too short a life. Never uses that phone. And we know, let's go back for a second, we know physical evidence. We've got our surveillance video. And ladies and gentlemen, when I submit that was the defendant's Jeep, it went by there at 1:03 a.m. Because think about it. Think about it. It is, and you saw it yourself, and you certainly heard from Mr. Brzezinski, you heard from Mr. Flusser. I wish it was like on TV and we could do what they do on TV with surveillance video. But you heard from these and why you can't. But you did hear from Mr. Brzezinski. You know what? When I first looked at it, I could not identify that vehicle. But you know what? When I see this vehicle that goes by in April of 2014, I see this vehicle that goes by on October 10th, 2010, yes, that is the same. It looks to me like that is in fact the same make and model of vehicle, and he explains why. He says you take the two photos of the light patterns, you put them one on top of the other, it's a perfect match. And think about it, ladies and gentlemen. Think about how many 1995 Jeep Grand Cherokees are driving around Wausau at 1 o'clock in the morning. We know the defendant was. We know he was out driving around at that point in time. How many others were out driving around at that point in time? 15-year-old vehicle. The dark Grand Cherokee as well, based on the videos. So we know, based upon the physical evidence, the defendant drove by Denmark at 1:03 a.m., turned onto Stephanie Lowe's street, turned to where the door is at 1 o'clock in the morning. We know that the murderer spent some time cleaning up at the apartment. Didn't do a great job, but did clean up some because we've got bleach. Obviously, the blood on the bed has been attempted to be cleaned off. We've got mop marks on the floor, in the hallway. And we know, ladies and gentlemen, that the defendant was there and didn't leave fingerprints or DNA behind. Because we know he was there because we know he went there and removed Stephanie Lowe's body. Again, he's guilty of hiding the corpse. The defense admits that. He's guilty of that part of it. He's there to get her body. So we know he can be there without leaving physical evidence behind. And we also know he took steps to prevent him from leaving physical evidence behind, because we know Andrea Wadinsky had a pair of gloves that were missing. There are gloves that were missing right after Stephanie Lowe was reported missing, and right after it was known Stephanie Lowe. What about Dr. Steer? Dr. Steer tells you Stephanie Lowe is a victim of a homicide. I can't tell you the exact cause of death. Her body suffered at least moderate decomposition. And he explained, he put in his report moderate to severe, and he said, well, to an extent, that depends on what you want to consider severe. Severe would be basically we've got a skeleton remaining, or parts of the skeleton. But there was certainly significant decomposition of the body. So I can't tell you the exact cause of death. Clearly, admittedly an unanswered question. But you know who caused us to have that unanswered question? The person that caused that is the defendant. Don't reward him for hiding that body. Burying Stephanie Lowe in a shallow grave for 4 years. Because Dr. Steer said one of the big things that I needed to be able to determine if she was strangled, exactly what the defendant told numerous people he did to Stephanie, said he had drive. See if there were those petechiae, those really pinpoint bruising, the rocks. Does that tell me that she was strangled? That's the best evidence we got, because a lot of times you can strangle someone without leaving any evidence behind at all, either externally or internally. Because Stephanie Lowe was buried for 4 years. You didn't have that evidence. Don't reward him for that. The only person that caused us to have that unanswered question is the defendant and his decision. But Dr. Steer also told me every single time I found a broken knife, it's happened a number of times with a body. And ladies and gentlemen, think about it. Think about what happens and the force it takes to break that knife off from the handle. Does that tell you something about what the defendant is doing? And I know they're going to say, we're going to hear from the defense, well, there weren't, Dr. Steer couldn't tell for sure if there was any wounds to the neck, which a number of witnesses told you about. Dr. Steer said, yeah, I couldn't. It doesn't mean they weren't there. It's just the decomposition prevented you from being able to tell if they were or not. So let's talk about the knives. There are 3 knives, actually 2 knives and 1 knife blade that were reported. First one was found in the boat. That's the first thing that really started getting us on the road to proving that the defendant is the one responsible. The one that Yvonne Wadinsky found the 17th or 18th of October when she went out to her cabin and found the knife in the boat. Second one is one that's found in the defendant's Jeep. That's taken. Both of those knives came from Andrea Wadinsky's knife set, the Martha Stewart everyday knife set that she had for some time. And finally, we have a knife blade found with Stephanie Lowe's body. It's important where that knife blade is found. We made a point of asking Dr. Colton about exactly where the blade was. She told you it was under some of Stephanie Lowe's clothing, but on top of some of the other clothes. In a position where you cannot see the knife blade until you start removing the clothing. That tells you, ladies and gentlemen, that the only person that's going to know that knife blade is there is the person who killed Stephanie Lowe, because if you just look at the body laying there, you can't see the knife blade. So if the defendant just happened upon this body, we're going to talk about how crazy that is and how there's no way that's going to have happened. It's not reasonable. But if that happened, and you just happen upon a body and decide to go drive an hour and 45 minutes and bury it, you won't know there's a knife there because you can't see it. You have to start taking her clothes off before you see the knife. And yet the defendant knows there's a knife there because he tells multiple people that. He tells them that before Stephanie Lowe's body is found. And you saw those knife blades, and again, this is just one piece of the evidence. It's not conclusive of it. But you saw the knife. The knives from the boat, the knife from the Jeep, and that knife blade. And they all look similar as far as material they're made of. Now, would it have been nice to have had broken off a little bit farther down so you could see NFC on there in China? Yeah, that would have been nice. But Detective Waltz told you that when you look at the width of the blade, that it's exactly the same width as that utility knife for the Martha Stewart everyday set. And they certainly appear, when you saw them, you have to look at them, they certainly appear to be made out of the same material. Again, as you heard from Detective Waltz, and again, she's totally honest with you. She tells you, look, yes, we checked with Martha Stewart every day. We checked with the manufacturer, and the manufacturer makes knives for many different companies. But it's one piece of evidence, and a piece of evidence that supports what the defendant told a number of people. The knife came from Andrea's house. And we know the first two did. What does the body of Stephanie Lowe tell us? It tells us she had defensive wounds. When she was fighting for her life, really warned that. She was cut on her left wrist, this area of her left wrist. She had broken fingernails. She was fighting for her life. Bigger and stronger. Tells us that her body was somewhat decomposed, and so that tells us we're not able to get to the exact cause of death. And the knife blade we just talked about, not visible to you when you can close. And that body, how it was, told us, as it told Dr. Steer, that Stephanie Lowe is the victim of homicide. How about the burial site? What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that everything he told us, and we talked about this, I'm not going to go over it at length, everything he told people, everything the defendant told every one of the witnesses that we know is absolutely true. That Stephanie Lowe was buried near Andrea Wadinsky's mother's cabin. That Stephanie Lowe was buried under a rock. That Stephanie Lowe was buried off of a forest road in a national forest. And that Stephanie Lowe was buried on October 10th, 2010. Because we know that to be true because of the testimony of Rocky Eisen, the Facebook pictures he posted, that shows clearly he was buried that day. What does the defendant's guilt of hiding the corpse tell us? I think it's important because, again, there's no question about his guilt. And while the judge is going to give you an instruction in just a little while that says this, you must make a finding as to each count of the information. Each count charges a separate crime, and you must consider each one separately. Your verdict for the crime charged in one count must not affect your verdict on any other count. In other words, just because you find the defendant guilty of one count doesn't mean you have to find him guilty of another count. But ladies and gentlemen, the facts that support each count support each other's accomplishments. And what does the defendant's guilt of hiding the corpse tell you? It tells you the defendant is the one who killed him. And I'll tell you why. When you walk through that door, when you go back there and start deliberating, you do not check with common sense at that door. The judge told you you can consider your experiences in the ordinary affairs of life in making your decision. And think about it. Think about it. You're looking for crack cocaine. It's the defendant's story. I was looking for crack cocaine that much. I'm desperate for it. I'd do anything for crack cocaine. Show up at Stephanie Lowe's apartment. They bring along a knife. You know, he brings along this Martha Stewart everyday utility knife. For the defendant to not be guilty of her murder, he has to find her body there when he gets there. What do you do? Well, maybe you try to find the crack. That's okay. But do you then wrap the body up in all the sheets on the bed, the blankets on the bed, the pillows on the bed? Go get your friend, Rich, bring him back there, stop at a quick trip, and come back and take the body, put it in your Jeep, drive an hour and 45 minutes to Wabeno, go to a hardware store, buy a shovel, right back to Wabeno, and go in the middle of the forest and bury the body. If all you did was find the body. You do that, ladies and gentlemen, because you want to cover up what you did. And in fact, that's one of the elements of hiding the corpse, is that you have to be doing it to hide, to try to avoid detection of criminal conduct. You only do all those things the defendant, without any question, did if you're the one that killed him. Consider his conduct in hiding the corpse. And that evidence, when you use your common sense, your ordinary experience, tells you beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant is the one who killed him. I want you to take a look again, and I think this is telling as well about the defendant's guilt. What happens? You see that? You find it describing, this is where Stephanie Lowe's body is. He tells law enforcement, yep, she's in there, as he's walking into that area with all the bushes and stuff around it. And then coming back out, as he's facing the camera that's being held by Detective Buckner, ew, hey, she's over there. Is that the actions of the person that cared about what happened here? Is that the actions of someone who was concerned, as Claudia is about her God? Is that the person, the actions of a person that just came upon a body and decided to bury it? Or is that the actions of someone who doesn't care, who doesn't give a damn what they did to this young lady back in October of 2010? That's what it is, ladies and gentlemen. And you heard that even in that video on the drive up to Wabeno, where he said the only person I feel sorry for in this case is Eric Mahomes. I'm sorry, you murdered a young lady and took her body and buried it in a forest, kept her from her family for 4 years, and the only person you care about, the only person you feel sorry for, is the person who got charged with drug dealing. It was clearly involved. That tells you the kind of person he is. You need to take a look at a timeline and show clearly. I think the timeline gives us a very clear idea of what happened that night. We know at 11:47, the defendant calls Eric Mahomes' phone. He's just about to leave Breakaway Bar. We know he leaves there at 12 o'clock, just before midnight, and then goes to Quick Trip. He leaves there at 12:07 a.m. We know at 12:20 a.m., the defendant's on his last phone call. Phone call that lasts about 2 minutes, and he makes no further calls between 12:20 and 2:30 a.m. 12:20 is as he's driving back to Andrea Wadinski's condominium to drop off Richard Hawkins. We know at 12:58, Stephanie Lowe is still alive because we hear her voice on a voicemail that's left to Kelly Wilkham. And we know 5 minutes later, a 1995 Jeep Grand Cherokee, having trouble with that, sorry, I'm trying to say it fast, a dark-colored 1995 Jeep Grand Cherokee drives by the Denmark bar and turns on to 7, going to Stephanie Lowe's apartment. We know at 2:30 the defendant is back on his phone. What's he doing between 1 o'clock and 2:30? He goes up to Stephanie Lowe's apartment. He goes up there claiming he wants to buy crack cocaine, but we know I don't have any money to buy crack cocaine. He takes a knife along. He takes along Andrea Wadinski's utility knife or her knife set. And he threatens Stephanie Lowe with that knife. You know he does that based on his statements. He threatens her. And she won't give him what he wants. And so he uses that knife with such force that he breaks the blade of that knife. And when Stephanie Lowe still won't die, he strangles her until she's dead. And then he spends some time trying to find the crack cocaine. Stephanie had hidden it sufficiently. He's not going to think to look way up in his closet. Remember, you saw Detective Barnes. He said, even I couldn't see it up there. And you saw how tall Detective Barnes is. Not a place he's going to go looking, because why would he expect petite 5'1", 5'2" Stephanie Lowe is going to place it that high up? He looks through the apartment, can't find it, and then starts making calls. He didn't get the crack he needed, so now he's got to try to. Robbery didn't work with Stephanie Lowe, so now he's trying to find some money, which is what Gretchen Huff says she expects he's calling him about. He can lose some more money off of her. Making calls there, making calls to some of his usual sources. And then he goes and picks up Rich and decides it's time I need to cover up what I did now. I've gotten the crack I need, but I need to cover up. He goes and gets Rich. At 6:45, he's at Quick Trip. 7:43 is when he's talking to Andrea at the store. He's probably there about 7:20, 7:25, based on his phone records. He leaves the store at 7:52 and takes that hour and 45-minute drive to Urbino. Stops at the cabin, takes the boat off, goes and talks to Andrea for a short time, and then goes to Mitch's hardware store. Hour and 45 minutes gets him up to Urbino, a little bit, about 9:37. Takes the time to get the boat off, get the everything set, and then drives to Mitch's hardware store, where at 10:04 he buys a shovel. Drives back to the cabin, another 10 minutes back, takes a few minutes to drive around and find the location where he's going to bury Stephanie's body. Digs the hole, buries her, with Rich's help, rolls a rock back on top of her, and drives back. He's an animal at 12:04. That timeline fits exactly what we know happened. And we know he's off his phone the whole time that he's going between 7:43 and 12:04 because he's out of range and he's on his way to bury the body. Now there was one call you heard about at 10 o'clock, but that was a call to him that went directly to voicemail. And we know then that he's again off his phone. He's making a bunch of calls between 1:04 when he gets back to Wausau and 2:15, actually 2:17, and then he's off his phone again. Back to the apartment to finish trying to clean up. He used bleach that he got from Andrea's apartment, or condo I should say, bleach that he takes from Stephanie's apartment, tries to clean up, and then leaves the doors unlocked. The park crosser, Shelley Resch, and Lisa Clindetti find the crime scene sometime after 5 o'clock. That's what our timeline tells us. That's what it tells us happened. Physical evidence, the phone records, and the rest of the physical evidence supports that's exactly what happened. Those early morning hours, and the afternoon hours. We talked about this in jury selection. Motive, opportunity, and means. Who had the motive to kill Stephanie Lowe? The defendant. He told multiple people, and you heard from multiple sources, he needed crack cocaine. Who had crack cocaine? Stephanie Lowe. Do anything for it. Anything included taking a knife, threatening Stephanie Lowe with that knife. She said no. He knew Stephanie Lowe had crack cocaine. He admitted that himself when they're driving up to Urbino. He heard that from his own mouth. But he didn't have the money. He had to steal it. Opportunity, I'm not going to go through this again, you just saw that. And the means. Knives. A knife is involved in Stephanie Lowe's death. It likely was not the cause of her death, but it certainly was involved because a knife was there. Broken off because of a violent activity in the defendant. And the defendant always has a knife handy. You see it. When he's going up to Urbino with Rebecca Torgerson, what's in the back seat of the van? Andrea Wadinsky's van. A large knife she had never seen before. Similar to a butcher knife. The knife involved here, the broken knife, didn't come from Stephanie's apartment. I was sorry I had to show that to Claudia. You saw the effect it had on her. It wasn't. It's consistent with the knives that Andrea had. But more importantly, the judge told you, he just told you a little while ago, you heard about 2 other incidents involving knives. You heard about those not because they show that he's a bad person, but to try and show the identity of the person involved. And what did you hear? You heard when the defendant had a problem with Matt Robinson. What did he do? He stabbed him in the neck. The exact same location. Dr. Torgerson, Richard Hawkins said, with Stephanie Lowe, stabbed, morning of October 10th, 2010. And the other time, when he has a problem with a girlfriend, what does he use? He uses a knife. What does he use when he's going to Wabino with Rebecca Torgerson? He has other plans for Rebecca after he's done cutting off the hands of Stephanie Lowe. And we have the utility mechanism. About the defendant's lies, I'm going to go through these quickly. He lied numerous times about, I never talked to Stephanie for 2 weeks. Oh, we know it's a lie. We know it's a lie based on his phone records. I was not at Stephanie and Eric's for a long time. That's a lie. He was there that night. Admittedly, without any question that night. I don't know where Stephanie is. In fact, Claudia went to talk to him, to beg with him. This is her daughter. She wants her daughter back. Begs the defendant, please, do you know where my daughter is? She had already asked him, please, just don't lie to me. He says, I won't. She asks him, do you know where Stephanie is? He's found his head. This is the It was a lie when he told law enforcement that, a lie he repeatedly tells. This is another one of the earliest examples of changing his story once he gets caught in that lie, is he initially tells Detective Morgan-Z, I didn't go anywhere on October 10th. No, that's a lie. We know he was at Wabino. We know he was at Pinch's hardware store. And when he gets caught in that lie, it's like, oh yeah, that's right. That's right. That's the day I took the boat up. Oh, wait a minute. He tells Detective Morgan-Z this the next day, and then all of a sudden, oh, wait, yeah. When I caught in that lie, I've got to tell the truth. Yeah, I went up there. But he doesn't tell the truth. He continues to lie. He says, I just went up there to bring the boat up there. He's asked about Rich. You heard that. You got to hear his statement when he's asked, who was the friend you went out with? The friend that he's known for 12 years. The friend that he brought back to Wisconsin from Alabama. The friend who was staying with him, living with him, who he was providing support for. What's his name? 30 seconds before he can finally come up with Rich or Richard. And then, when asked what the last name is, gives a name Millhouse. A lie. I was calling E from different contacts, or from a different E from contacts. You know that's a lie. I didn't see Stephanie that night. Well, that's a lie. He told law enforcement early on that he went back to Andrea's condo after he left the breakaway and stayed there and drank with Rich. Well, that's a lie. He was asked, is it totally beyond the realm of possibility that you went to Stephanie Lowe's that night? No, absolutely. I did not go there. There's no way I was at Stephanie Lowe's that night. That's a lie. Just he went with the boat to Wabino. That's a lie. I helped them mop the floors. And remember they were asking him, is there a reason why DNA might be there, there's a reason why your fingerprints might be there. And he tells a really interesting lie. He says, I helped them mop the floors when they moved in. You heard everything. You probably see his reaction like, seriously? You helped us mop the floors? No. Why does he decide to lie and say he helped mop the floors? It's because he's concerned that his DNA or his fingerprints might be on that mop. Why would he be concerned about that? Because he used the mop. Now, it wasn't there, and that's unfortunate, but it wasn't tested for a couple of weeks. Actually, more than that. It wasn't checked for DNA for several weeks after the homicide. You heard from Ms. Cole, Captain Cole, when she testified that, yeah, a smooth surface like that it's there for weeks. Absolutely, that DNA can be easily be gone by that. And it's sitting there, and who knows who handled it between October 10th and November 1st when it was finally swabbed for DNA. But why would he make up a story about mopping the floors if he was not concerned? Just like he was concerned his DNA would be underneath Stephanie Lowe's fingernails, he was concerned it might be on that mop, so he has to make up a story about that. And he had no way of knowing when he makes up that story that law enforcement had seen a mop in a bucket, unless he's the one. He had to throw it. The reason he's got his stop snitching shirt on backwards is because, or inside out, is he just threw something on to go pick up dope. Well, we know that's not the truth, because what he did was he went to pick up Rich to go dispose of the body. He claimed that he didn't know that Stephanie Lowe had drugs. He doesn't want to put himself as having a reason to go there during the investigation. We know that's a lie, because he admitted that much as he leads law enforcement. The final story I want to talk about is consciousness of guilt. Remember this whole thing about Joshua Howard. For Howard, you heard the testimony, contacts my office less than a month before trial, or about a month before trial, February of this year. Provides law enforcement, says, I've got information about the defendant. He's confessed to me his involvement. And he makes sure he gives us some good information that is able to be confirmed. Information that's consistent with what the other people who got up here testified about told you. And got to be really good, so he makes sure he includes one more thing that law enforcement knows about, has never been part of the public record, and none of the other witnesses said happened. One more fact that's absolutely true. They know, he knows that he's got to be called as a witness. The defendant and Joshua Howard worked that all out. They plotted together. And they plot together that it's going to be this information that law enforcement's going to get that's going to make sure that Josh Howard gets on the witness stand. And when he gets on the witness stand, you heard it in the defendant's own words, from his phone call that he makes to Kristen Jonda the night before Josh Howard is supposed to testify. It's all a setup. A setup to create an appeal issue. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you don't appeal an acquittal. You don't appeal a finding of not guilty. You only appeal if you know you're going to be convicted. And you know you're going to be convicted because you know you're guilty. Fortunately for the defendant, things didn't work out for Josh Howard to testify as planned on March 16th. And Detective Holtz, doing the thorough, complete job that she's done throughout this investigation, listened that night to this phone call. We were able to prevent the defendant from sabotaging this trial, from wasting all of our time by creating an appeal issue where there isn't. He does that because he knows he's guilty and he just wants to be able to get another chance. Another chance for maybe the state to make a mistake. We can only do that. Is this an intentional homicide? Yes. Well, we got to consider the fact that the defendant's definition of intent, when he says, I didn't intentionally do it, he says it requires, I've got pre-planning up there, he uses the word foreplanning, and then following through. But we know that's not what intent means. The judge just told you a little while ago what intent means. Intent requires that the defendant takes actions that he knows is practically certain to cause the death of the person. And he doesn't have to think about it for a month, a day, an hour, a minute. You do not have to pre-plan anything. Premeditation, which is what you always hear on TV, is not part of first-degree intentional homicide in Wisconsin. You only have to intend at the moment you take action to kill the person. And if he didn't intend to kill Stephanie Lowe, why does he use a knife with so much violence that he snaps that knife off? And as he says to various people, does he strangle her? The knife doesn't work. And if he wasn't intending to rob Stephanie Lowe of the drugs, the money, why does he take a knife? That's what he uses to Stephanie Lowe's. In summary, ladies and gentlemen, you have uncontroverted, clear evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that shows that the defendant is guilty of every single crime that he's charged. You've got his admissions, including his own words that you heard, show that he's the one who took Stephanie Lowe's life. You have what physical evidence there is corroborating what everybody tells you happened. We have evidence of motive, opportunity, and means. Repeated lies. We have the defendant's plot to sabotage this crime. Ladies and gentlemen, harkening back to another comment from defense counsel's opening statement, I do care about the verdict on the first degree intentional homicide. I care about your verdict on every one of the counts in this case. I care, ladies and gentlemen, because after almost 6.5 years, it's time to finally find Stephanie Lowe in some degree of justice. It's time to provide Claudia Blake and the rest of Stephanie Lowe's family, after 6.5 long years, 4 years of which they had no idea what happened to them at home. Time to finally provide them with some degree of justice. It's time to finally provide Stephanie Lowe's friends justified on the witness stand. You saw how it still affects them. 6.5 long years of finally provide them some degree of justice. And ladies and gentlemen, it's finally time after 6.5 years to hold that defendant accountable for what he did to that young lady, robbing her of the rest of her life, robbing her family and her friends of her. It's finally time to find him accountable. It's time to find him guilty after consideration of all the evidence, guilty of the first-degree intentional homicide of Stephanie Lowe, guilty of the attempted armed robbery of Stephanie Lowe, and guilty of hiding the corpse of Stephanie Lowe. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, find the defendant guilty on all 3 counts.
We'll take about a 15-minute break here and come back with the rest of the evidence. You may be seated. The attorneys have a question about one of the instructions that wasn't given. We're in recess, so you can take a break for 15 minutes.